Okay, welcome. In this video, we are going to cover the introduction to the respiratory system and the upper respiratory system. So the respiratory system's primary function is transporting oxygen into the bloodstream. That's how all of our cells get the oxygen that they need to function. It gets delivered to our tissues, for our organs, for all of the cellular respiration and the functions necessary for life. Our respiratory system moves about 12,000 quarts of air per day in and out of the lungs. The respiratory system removes waste gas in the form of generally carbon dioxide so that it doesn't build up in toxic levels. Cellular respiration depends on a continuous supply of oxygen, which is found in abundance in the air that we breathe. Using oxygen produces carbon dioxide, which would become toxic if allowed to build up in the bloodstream and therefore must be removed. The respiratory system, of course, is closely related to the heart and the circulatory system. They work together as the cardiopulmonary system to deliver oxygen and nutrients and to remove waste all around the body. The components of the respiratory system include the two lungs, which are the vital organs of the respiratory system, the upper and lower airways that conduct gas in and out of the system, terminal air sacs called alveoli, which are surrounded by a network of capillaries that provide for gas exchange with the blood, as well as the thoracic cage, which houses, protects, and facilitates the function for the system. Muscles of breathing include the main muscle of the diaphragm, which you see down there below the thoracic cage, as well as accessory muscles. Air contains many gases, predominantly nitrogen, which is a support gas that helps keep lungs open with its constant volume and pressure. The next highest concentration found in air is oxygen, which is essential to life, and carbon dioxide is also found in very small concentrations, as well as a number of other trace amounts of gases. Ventilation is the bulk movement of air into and out of the lungs where gas exchange will take place. So ventilation is the mechanical process of breathing. Respiration, on the other hand, is the process of gas exchange. It's the chemical process where oxygen is added to the blood and carbon dioxide is removed. External respiration is where gas is exchanged in the lungs between the blood and the air in the external atmosphere. Internal respiration, on the other hand, is where oxygenated blood is transported internally by the cardiovascular system to cells and tissues. The oxygen moves into the cells as the carbon dioxide is removed. In this chart, you can see that 78%, almost 80% of the air that we breathe is actually made up of nitrogen. Oxygen, the reason essentially that we are inhaling, is only about 21% of the air, but still a very significant amount. There's also lots of different amounts of trace gases, argon, neon, krypton, all these different gases in the air, as well as a small amount of carbon dioxide.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy. And breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells into the plasma and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
Okay, so here we see the difference at a glance in ventilation and external and internal respiration. So you see that with ventilation, that is again the mechanical process of your lungs expanding and contracting, inhaling and exhaling a volume of air. And then we see that respiration is the more chemical level, where gases are being exchanged first from outside air into our blood and then from the blood to our internal body cells. We have a reserve of oxygen to last about 4 to 6 minutes. After that, we will die if we don't get more oxygen. The respiratory system is a series of branching tubes called bronchi and bronchioles. Bronchi being the plural form of bronchus, which comes from the Latin word for throat. The suffix "ol," as in bronchial, arterial, vacuole, etc., denotes that it is a smaller version of that prefix word or root. In this case, small bronchus. The bronchi and bronchioles transport atmospheric gas deep within the lungs to small air sacs called alveoli, which represent the terminal end of the respiratory system. This is where the respiratory system ends. Alveoli is the plural of alveolus, which comes from the Latin alveus, which means cavity, also basin, trough, womb, other things like that, plus the suffix "ol" again, that word that means little that we talked about before. An alveolus is a little cavity or a small hollow sac. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. The combination is called the alveolar capillary membrane. It represents the connection between the respiratory and cardiovascular systems. Our upper airways consist of the nose, the mouth, the pharynx, and the larynx. Their functions include heating or cooling inspired gases to body temperature, filtering the air that we breathe, humidifying the air that we breathe, also obviously giving us our sense of smell or olfaction, producing sounds or phonations, and ventilation or conducting gas to the lower airways. So they're mechanically conducting the gas that we breathe in down into the lower airways. While some people breathe through their mouths, we are meant to breathe through our noses. Our nose is the rigid structure made of cartilage and bone. The nasal cavity, which is behind the nose inside of our skull, is divided into three main regions: the vestibular region, the olfactory region, and the respiratory region. Here you see the path of air through the upper respiratory system, represented by those blue arrows, starting at the vestibular region, into the respiratory region, through the olfactory region, down the trachea, into the lower respiratory system and the lungs. The vestibular region, located inside the nostrils and contains coarse nasal hairs that act as the first line of defense for the respiratory system. These hairs are covered with sebum, which is a greasy substance secreted by sebaceous glands of the nose. You may remember from the integumentary system when we talked about hair has sebum secreting sebaceous glands at the base of the follicle. Sebum helps trap particles and keeps the hairs soft and pliable. The olfactory region, located on the roof of the nasal cavity, is allowing air to be held there so it can be sampled. Olfactory being our sense of smell, a little holding area that allows that air to kind of sit there a little bit longer, allowing our chemoreceptors to sense the different smells or chemicals in that air. The respiratory region is where air is warmed up to body temperature and moistened inside the nasal cavity. It's lined with mucous membranes and has a rich blood supply. There are three scroll-like bones called turbinates that split the incoming air into three channels, providing more surface area for things to be trapped, for things to cross over boundaries, and so on. The turbinates serve to make the incoming air more turbulent. That's where they get their name, bringing more air in contact with mucous membranes for warming and moisture, adding 650 to 1,000 milliliters of water each day to the moistened air to bring it to about 80% relative humidity. Now, allergic rhinitis occurs when allergens like pollen trigger nasal mucosa to secrete excessive mucus. Treatments include antihistamine medications, allergy injections that help desensitize a person. In other cases, in severe cases, you can take other medications. The word rhinitis probably makes you think of rhinoceros. Rhino means nose, and that suffix seros in rhinoceros comes from the Greek word keros or keros, which means horn. So rhinoceros just means nose horn. Nasal polyps are non-cancerous growths within the nasal cavity. They may be related to chronic inflammation. If they start to block the nasal passageway, they might be surgically removed. Though if they are not interfering with your respiration, with your ventilation, typically they'll be left there. The mucociliary escalator is a fancy name for the system that moves mucus through our respiratory tract. So we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells that line our airways. Each one of these cells has 200 to 250 cilia on its surface. Remember, cilia are those little tiny hairs. The goblet cells and submucosal glands scattered throughout our mucus lining there are what's actually producing the mucus. They each produce about 100 milliliters per day of mucus. Mucus resides as two layers. First, we have the cilia sitting in the sol layer. This is thin, watery fluid that allows these little tiny hairs to beat freely. And then on top of that sits the gel layer that's more viscous. It's a little more kind of dried out and thicker and sticky. It's more what we think of when we think of mucus. And it is there to trap small particles. It's basically like lining our respiratory system with flypaper. Anything that touches it's going to stick to it. The cilia beat up to 1,500 times per minute and propel the gel layer and its trapped debris onward and upward about 1 inch per minute to be expelled. In the nose, debris-laden secretions are pushed toward the front of the nasal cavity to be expelled through the nose. So when you blow or pick your nose, that's that debris-filled secretions that are drying out, coming out of your nose. The epithelium there also propels that gel layer toward the oral cavity to be expectorated with cough or swallowed into the stomach. Here we see an illustration of what those little cilia and that watery sol layer look like. And then you see there's a thicker gel layer sitting on top. You have these little submucosal glands and goblet cells that are actually producing the mucus that lines this membrane. So dried nasal mucus, what you guys all call a booger, is the result of the drying out of our colloidal mucus, which we call snot. Not all the mucus is able to stay fluid enough to be moved by the cilia in that mucociliary escalator. The closer the mucus is to being in the nasal vestibule and near the nostril opening where it's being exposed to all that air coming in and out, it tends to lose its moisture and is more likely to dry out and become stuck. In his book, Gastronaut, Stephen Gates discusses eating dried nasal mucus and says that 44% of people he questioned said they had eaten their own dried nasal mucus in adulthood and they liked it. As mucus filters airborne contaminants, eating it could be thought to be unhealthy, but Gates comments that our body has been designed to consume snot because the nasal mucus is normally swallowed after being moved inside by the motion of the cilia. And in fact, our digestive systems, the acid in our stomachs is often enough to destroy most of any harmful pathogens that might be in there. Now, Friedrich Bischinger, a lung specialist at a clinic, says that nose picking and eating could actually be beneficial for the immune system. Still not going to do it. If that made any of you hungry, go ahead and take this opportunity to pause the video, go grab a snack, come back and join us. The skull contains air-filled cavities called sinuses that connect to the nasal cavity by small passageways. Sinuses are located around the nose and sometimes referred to as paranasal sinuses. They're cavities that help prolong and intensify sound produced with our voice and helps to lighten the weight of the head. So a lot of how we are able to hear ourselves speak so loudly when in fact the words we're saying are moving outwards away from our body is because these sinuses in our face kind of echo what we're saying, which is also partially responsible for why we sound different to ourselves when we're speaking than when we hear our recorded voice played back. What we're used to hearing is how it sounds kind of reverberating in our nasal cavities. Our sinuses do not exist at birth. They develop as we grow. In fact, a lot of the changes you see in facial features have to do with the development of the sinuses as well as the development of the jaw. The sinuses also help to warm and moisturize air. Here we can see all of the different sinuses, and you notice from the skeletal system that a lot of these names, if you remember any of the skeletal bones of the skull, are very familiar. The names of the sinuses coincide with the names of the facial bones. The pharynx, or throat, is a hollow muscular structure beginning behind the nasal cavity, lined with epithelial tissue. The pharynx can be divided into three sections: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngo or laryngopharynx. And here we see again that image of the arrangement. Again, those blue arrows represent the path of air, and you see at the top the nasopharynx, moving downward the oropharynx, and finally the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is the uppermost section beginning behind the nasal cavity. The section contains lymphatic tissue called adenoids, and passageways into the middle ear called eustachian tubes. The air from the nasal cavity passes through the nasopharynx. The oropharynx is located behind the oral or buccal cavity and conducts not only atmospheric gases, but also food and liquid. Air breathed through the nose and mouth passes through here, as does anything that is swallowed. The tonsils are part of the lymph system. The palatine tonsils are located in the oropharynx, as are lingual tonsils located at the back of the tongue. During swallowing, the uvula and the soft palate move in posterior and superior position, in other words, backwards and upwards, to protect the nasopharynx and the nasal cavity from the entry of food or liquids. Occasionally, this natural response is overcome by forceful laughing while trying to eat or drink at the same time. The laryngopharynx is the lowermost portion of the pharynx. Air breathed and or swallowed passes through the laryngopharynx. Swallowed materials pass through the esophagus to get to the stomach. Air travels through the larynx and the trachea on its way to the lungs. Your larynx or voice box is a semi-rigid structure composed of cartilage connected by muscles and ligaments that provide movement of the vocal cords to control speech. The Adam's apple, more prominent in men, is part of your thyroid cartilage. It's the largest of the cartilages found in the larynx. The cricoid cartilage lies beneath it, which provides the structure and support for the airways so that they do not collapse. So it's very strong, stiff cartilage that helps hold that part of the airway open. The glottis is the opening that leads into the larynx and eventually into the lungs. The epiglottis, of course, epi meaning on top of or above, so this is a structure that sits on top of the glottis, is a leaf-shaped, flap-like fibrocartilage. It closes the opening to the larynx when you swallow. This happens when you breathe as part of your swallowing reflex, the glottic or sphincter mechanism. It seals so that food doesn't enter your lungs, so your body can tell the difference whether you're inhaling a breath or trying to swallow food or drink, and it will close off the appropriate pathway so that you don't get things going down the wrong pipe. Occasionally, if you've had a forceful inhale or a laugh or things like that, there are certain circumstances that you're all familiar with where something can, quote, go down the wrong pipe or go up the wrong tube. Vocal cords act as the dividing line between the upper and lower airways. The lower airway starts below the vocal cords. The upper airway ends at the vocal cords. So this is where we will end our video today. Next time, we will join with the lower respiratory system.